In the realm of politics, and especially in the current U.S. presidential race, extreme emotions such as anger, revulsion, and even hatred have once again proved to be seductive and powerful for politicians, for their supporters, and for the public writ large. Why, and at what cost? American philosopher Martha Nussbaum explores the problem of political emotions in her new book. It's called Anger and Forgiveness: Resentment, Generosity, Justice. She is the professor of law and ethics at the University of Chicago, and we are pleased to welcome Martha Nussbaum to our program. She joins us now on the line from Chicago, Illinois. It's great to finally have you on this program. We've tried for an awfully long time.
It's great to be on the program.
Delighted to have you here.
Yeah.
I would like to just start by having you describe the emotional landscape of your country at this particular moment in its presidential season.
Woo. Well, I mean, in fact, I wrote the book like 3 years ago, so I had no idea that it would be so relevant. But I think right now there is a very ugly and, to me, scary amount of anger around in the campaign. There's a lot of feeling, I think there's a feeling of helplessness on the part of some parts of the electorate. And one thing I talk about in the book is that when people feel helpless, it's very hard for them to live with that. And so often they decide to blame somebody, and it could almost be anyone. But in this case, now there's a tendency to blame Hillary, blame immigrants, blame minorities for the economic problems and the difficulties that white American working class men are facing. And there are real problems. We know that the health of white men is declining. The jobs in the manufacturing sector have moved offshore. And so the result is that people are just flailing around and wondering what to do about it. And instead of trying to solve the problem, they decide to blame. And that to me is what's particularly scary, because it suggests that even after the election, there might not be an acceptance of the result. And we're starting to hear that from Mr. Trump. And so I do feel that it's a real scary note for democracy at this point.
Let me contrast those comments with some made by Michael Barone, the journalist, some 25 years ago, who said, when referring to Pat Buchanan, the populist Republican who was running for president back then, Pat's going to go nowhere in politics because Americans aren't angry people and they don't trust angry people with power. So as you fast forward 25 years and you see that probably at least 40% of Americans say they're angry enough to vote for somebody as reprehensible as Donald Trump, what's going on to make that possible?
Yeah. Well, see, I think Americans always were angry people. The image of masculinity was always that of a very strong potential for anger. When Michael Dukakis, whom you may have forgotten about, ran for president, he lost the election basically because he didn't express enough anger on national TV when he was asked what would happen if his wife was raped. He had created a prison work release program that resulted in one rapist being let go.
We remember Willie Horton in 1988.
Willie Horton. You remember Willie Horton. Well, he just, asked that question. He responded rationally and calmly, and that was the wrong thing. I think Pat Buchanan didn't go anywhere because at that stage, Americans were welcoming of immigrants. And when he came to Chicago to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade on an anti-immigrant platform, people said, "What do you mean? We're all immigrants, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, etc." And so that just didn't go anywhere. But right now, unfortunately, with the loss in working class employment, there's this feeling that jobs that are so-called ours, I mean, the white working class men think jobs belong to them and they shouldn't be taken by women, they shouldn't be taken by African Americans, and they certainly shouldn't be taken by any kind of Latino immigrant. That's the change, is the great suspiciousness of immigrants.
I suspect, though, that on this side of the Great Lakes, we have always looked south, sometimes with admiration, but certainly always with the notion that America was the land of hope and opportunity and all that. And I wonder whether your students in Chicago still manifest those hopeful views.
Well, I wish I could say that they did. I think that instead, so what we see on the part of younger people is a different kind of anger, but it's also, I think, not very productive, which is in the followers of Bernie Sanders. You see I'm not going to talk about Sanders himself, but a lot of his followers, a kind of utopian anger, like let's smash the system and let's destroy the banks and let's start all over again, that is just as doomed and just as unproductive as what you get on the right. And so these words are hurled about, socialism, this and that, and the bad banks. And, you know, the fact is one of the nation's most admired founders, who's now being a hero on Broadway, was Alexander Hamilton, who created the central bank. And so people are cheering for Lin-Manuel Miranda, a great genius of the theater, who created this play about Hamilton. And yet they're saying, let's smash the banks, let's destroy the centralized economy. And so it's a very weird and I think ultimately very unproductive kind of anger on the left.
Well, again, as we look from this side of the border, you want to talk weird. I cannot recall a campaign where the sexual histories of the current Republican nominee and actually the husband of the current Democratic nominee appear to be everyone's obsession with 3 weeks to go. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, it's retaliatory. That is to say, what Trump says and has apparently done is highly relevant to his being the president of a nation more than half of whose citizens are women. But then he responds by hurling mud at Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton, everything has already been gone through. He was impeached but not convicted. And besides, he isn't the candidate. No one stops to say, hey, wait a minute, Hillary is the candidate. And there's something extremely sexist, I think, in the perception that, of course, she's really a puppet of her husband. No, she isn't. She got better grades in law school, if the truth be known, and she was always a highly intelligent and ambitious person, and now she is the candidate. And what she has done, apparently forgiving her husband, is between the two of them. I think people should have a little bit of privacy in their relationships, but I guess I think that, sure, he's an imperfect person and that's well known, but the fact that she has gone through that and she is loyal to him and she has forgiven him is her business, and it's, I think, to her great credit that she's capable of generosity and forgiveness. But it doesn't have any bearing on her. It's simply because there's nothing Trump can say about her personal sexual conduct that he decides to go after the husband. But that does betray a sexist perception that she's really just a puppet.
Let's go from generosity and forgiveness back to anger for a second, and I want to read an excerpt from the New Yorker magazine about Donald Trump and his supporters in the state of West Virginia, one of whom said the following: if we're going to go trillions of dollars in debt over Iraq, why can't we go billions of dollars in debt and make every single coal-producing plant clean in West Virginia? Don't we deserve a hand? We built this country with the steel that came out of our coal, and we protected this country with our soldiers, and nobody cares. We're more willing to give millions of dollars to people in other countries who just as soon put a bullet in the back of our heads. That's why West Virginia is going to vote for Trump. How much sympathy do you have with that argument?
Well, of course, Trump isn't making any rational proposal to help the coal plants become clean. If he was making a positive economic proposal, I think we should listen to it, and we should ask whether the cost of doing that makes any sense in terms of what the future of those people would be going forward. I guess I actually think, from the time I've spent in that part of the country, that there was like a long period of denial, just as with the tobacco industry, that there was denial and therefore a refusal to reinvest in different technologies, in different employment opportunities for those people. One result is that in that region, which is a prime area for ecological tourism, it's been so devastated by the mining, the strip mining, that they can't even have that economic alternative of ecological tourism. So I guess I think big mistakes were made by the coal industry in the past, and it's just not enough to say, oh, we'll put a Band-Aid over it and all these people will keep their jobs. I think the coal industry, like the tobacco industry, has told lies about the damages of that industry to the environment. And so, let's figure out how to put those people to work in some constructive way going forward. That we need to do that. But I'm not sure that the best solution is, in fact, to fix the existing coal plants. I would rather explore economic alternatives. And now, Trump is not doing that. Trump is just trying to stir up the anger, and he doesn't have a substantive economic plan for those states.
No, fair enough, but if you found yourself in that predicament, would anger or rage or even hatred not be a rational response to what you see as your country being prepared to spend billions on foreign wars, but nothing to retrain me or find me another job?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is, what is anger? And I spend some time on this in the book and take apart the different constituent parts of anger, and I say, basically agreeing with Aristotle, but there are a lot of philosophers who come along who agree with that anger is a pained response to what the person thinks of as a significant damage to that person's well-being that was wrongfully inflicted. Now, so far, so good. Lots of things meet that description, and it's good to notice wrongful damages when they occur. I don't know whether the case that we're talking about would be in that category, and then the question is, who did the wrong? I would say that the coal industry itself is to blame for a lot of the wrong. But in any case, it's good to notice wrongful damages when they occur. But then, what is added is that the angry person wishes and hopes that there will be some kind of payback. In other words, believes that the doer should suffer. Now, that's where I think we stop making sense. It's not obvious that to make the doer suffer solves the problem going forward. Now, of course, we need a system of punishment, and of course, it's quite right that punishment does have a value going forward because we want to deter other people from doing similarly bad things, and we want to incapacitate wrongdoers and so on. But it's not just payback for payback's sake that solves the problem. If there's a murder that's committed and we put the murderer to death, that does not bring back the life that was lost. So I think any rational policy has to recognize that it's futile to think that payback automatically in and of itself solves your problems. You need to look at the world going forward. And all of the revolutionary movements that I talk about in the book that have been successful and valuable, those of Martin Luther King Jr., of Gandhi in India, of Mandela in South Africa, have turned forward. And they've said, well, let's see what kind of treatment of the wrongdoer, what kind of relationship with the wrongdoer is actually going to solve the problem. And I think that is what we need to do right now. Now, that doesn't mean that no crimes would be punished. Of course, they would be. But it does mean that the main accent should be on doing something that's sensible in the future. And so when, let's say, my relative dies in the hospital and I feel great grief and helplessness, and I think right away, I'll sue the doctors, that's not very helpful. If there is malpractice, then of course, it's valuable for there to be lawsuits because that does help deter malpractice and so on. But the gut reaction that says somebody's got to pay and I'm going to solve my anguish about this death by making that doctor pay, that is by itself an irrational reaction and it doesn't do any good. So I think that the anger that people feel comes from the fact that they just don't know how to solve the problem, and they'd rather not face the real problem. They'd rather just hit somebody over the head with a stick and then pretend that that helps to solve the problem.
Of those three names that you just mentioned, Gandhi, King, Mandela, they are, I guess, they'd be at the top of your list of political heroes, and I wonder what the ethical significance of their nonviolent approach to solving problems would be in your mind.
Yeah. Well, I want to, first of all, distinguish non-anger from nonviolence, because I'm not a pacifist. King was not a pacifist. He said there could be a just war, and he said violence and self-defense was sometimes permissible. Gandhi was the only one who was totally against violence. Mandela, of course, started to use guerrilla tactics at one stage when the appeal to nonviolence had failed. But what they were all opposed to was the mentality of payback for payback's sake. So they were against anger, not so much against the strategic use of violence in certain narrow cases. And I think that those policies were extremely valuable because in all three cases, you could have had extremely destructive wars in this country. There could have been race wars that would continue until the present day. And yet King persuaded people that, yeah, we need radical change, we need the justice system to change, we need civil rights, but we need to work with people going forward, and we need to be able to, at some point, look forward to an era when little black boys and little black girls will be able to hold hands together as sisters and as brothers, as he famously put it. And the same thing was true of Mandela. The ANC itself thought, oh, these horrible whites who have oppressed us for so many years, let's try to punish them by making sure that rugby is decertified as a national sport, by making sure that their national anthem is thrown out and we have our anthem. And Mandela saw that actually that punitive, backward-looking approach was not all that helpful, that the only thing that would carry the country forward was a kind of partnership between the humiliated, previously the black population and the apartheid people, even though, of course, what they had done was really, really wrong. Now, how do you do justice to the fact that what they had done was really, really wrong, while at the same time moving forward? Well, that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was all about. They come forward, they tell the truth, creating a public record of what is unacceptable going forward in close connection to writing a new constitution with an enumerated list of fundamental rights. And then you say, okay, now at this point we're going to move beyond that, and we try to do that. So I think that was what was so valuable about that approach. It didn't deny that wrong is wrong, and it made sure that that was put on the record. But at the same time, the accent was on, okay, let's figure out now what we're going to do to run a decent country going forward.
Let me get your view then on your fellow Chicagoans' decision, Barack Obama, to have Osama bin Laden killed. Do we consider that to be a legitimate response to 9/11, or is that more along the lines of revenge and payback, which you don't approve of?
Well, you know, I think I wasn't privy, of course, no one is privy to all the deliberations that went on around that. I think that although on the whole assassination is usually a very, very bad idea, the hope was that he was a pivotal player in that movement and that killing him off would certainly be the most severe kind of blow to the rest of that movement. And of course, it was not just a blow to his movement, but it was also a signal to other people that would deter them from taking actions to join that movement. So I guess on that basis, so we have to look at the calculation ex ante and we have to look at what's become of it ex post. I think it was a perfectly reasonable decision, and unfortunately it has not by itself stopped the spread of terrorist violence, but it's probably contributed toward that end as well as anything else. So as I say, I'm not opposed to violence. I think the Second World War was a just war. I'm shocked and appalled by pacifists who say that they don't think we should have fought in the Second World War. So, you know, this was sort of like that. That is, it's a strategic use of violence to prepare for a better world in the future.
And as long as we're on the subject of your fellow Chicagoan, what do you think of President Obama as the model of a non-angry politician?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually know Barack because I, had an office a few doors down from him in the law school. He genuinely is, I think, a very non-angry person. It's not a labored effort of self-control. But I also think that we know full well that in American politics, an angry black man is an impossible figure. So if he had been a person who had tendencies in the direction of anger, he had better not express it. And he would have had to discipline himself out of that, because more than other people, more than women even, and more than white men, a black man who's angry is something that immediately people, a large number of people, recoil from as something that's incredibly scary. Part of race prejudice in the U.S. is the fear of the black man as a marauding criminal and a rapist. So Obama, besides being actually half white in origin, and he's not really African American, so he's half African and half white. He's born in Hawaii. So he had a non-standard biography in terms of African Americans in this country that helped him. He is light-skinned, and that, unfortunately, that also helped him. But the non-anger was a part also of the kind of credentials that made it possible for him to get to where he was.
Let me try this excerpt from the Atlantic magazine and get you to comment on this. Here we go. This is Michelle Cottle from earlier in the month. If anything, Trumpism has in part made the rest of the nation all the more eager to ignore the millions of white voters living on the edges of the economy. Many may now be written off without guilt because they have shown themselves to be not just unfortunates but undesirables, irredeemable hate-mongers itching to reassert their cultural dominance. It leaves Americans that much more segregated and alienated from one another. It's exactly this kind of cross-cultural suspicion and mistrust that has enabled Trump to come within spitting distance of the presidency. And it's what threatens to keep his supporters isolated and fuming on the sidelines long after their champion has forgotten them. And it's that I want to pick up on. I wonder whether, if in fact he loses, and if in fact he goes away and no longer is the champion of this movement, do you see the potential for the development of some kind of fascist movement in America to represent these people?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. It's scary. I guess I think on balance, no, because I actually think that Hillary Clinton has very sensible policies that, if implemented, really would improve the life chances of working class men as well as working class people generally. In particular, her plan for cost-free university admissions in state universities. I mean, look, the reason these people are out of work when they are is largely that the employment market has changed. It requires education that a certain generation of workers doesn't have. And so the remedy, it may take a generation for it to kick in fully, but the remedy is certainly to provide low cost, and in her case, cost-free, higher education. So I do think that's much more helpful in actually assuaging the real pain of white American men than anything that Trump proposes. So I guess I think people will wake up and see that. The real economic problems of white men are real, but of course they're problems for low-educated people across the country. They're not all white men. And so we need to do something about that. Hillary has proposed something that really addresses that. Trump has not. And so let's hope if and when she wins that the people will see that it's actually good for them.
I know Secretary Clinton apologized for calling a large chunk of Trump supporters so-called deplorables, but I want to play a little piece of tape right now of P.J. O'Rourke on why, in his view, it's not a good idea to mock Trump supporters. Sheldon, let's play that, please.
There has been tremendous scorn for and fun made of Trump and indeed Trump supporters. And when you are angry at the establishment and you see the establishment not just disagreeing with your candidate, but mocking your candidate, there is an element that says, no, they're mocking me. Almost every time you went out to make fun of Trump, you increased his support because people were feeling scorned. You know, when people feel that they are outsiders, you cannot convince them by mocking them.
Would you call that mocking or expressing oneself dismissively about Trump's supporters a form of revenge?
Well, actually, I don't think it was either mocking or dismissing. I think what Hillary meant to convey was that racism is something we should all strongly deplore, meaning we should say it's wrong and be against it, that sexism is something we should all deplore, meaning we should say it's wrong and be against it, and that the hatred of immigrants is also wrong, and we should deplore it. Now, I don't think she expressed herself clearly. I think it was interpreted as mocking and dismissing, but I think that's what she clearly meant by it. And I think that it's quite right. We should deplore racism, sexism, and the hatred of immigrants. Now, the people, it's the different thing. Dr. King always said what you have to do in politics is to separate the deed from the doer, and you would deplore the bad deed, but you express some kind of basic respect for people, and you hope that once they understand the argument, they can be brought round to a better way of seeing things, and I do think that that's correct. So I guess I think the right attitude is to say, what you are saying about women, about minorities, about immigrants is just dead wrong, and I deplore those statements and any acts that go with it. But I respect you as a person, and I think that there should be equal respect in this country for all citizens. Now, I actually think that the people that they should really be complaining about are the standard Republicans who for so many years have totally ignored working class Republicans. They've had a set of policies that do favor rich elites. Mitt Romney was a candidate of elite donors who just had no idea what the lives of people in the working class were. And most of the popular Republicans were really out of touch. And so those people to whom they naturally would have brought their grievances were not listening to them, and that's why they turned to Trump. They probably wouldn't have turned to Hillary anyway, but in any case, I think they really should be bringing a lot of their anger to the Republicans who failed to notice their problems. And let's hope that some recognizable, sane, and rational party will survive this and will be able to regroup. But I don't know what's going to happen. I think the Republican Party may split, and people are saying it may be like the Whig Party before the Civil War that just ceased to exist in the struggle over slavery. So I don't know what kind of party structure we'll see, but I don't think that it's going to be a fascist movement.
I normally don't like to go off the path when I do an interview, but you just said something that I thought is worth going off the path for a second, and that is, who is the candidate of the elite donors in this case? I don't think there's a single Fortune 100 company CEO who has given money to Donald Trump. I think we're all very well aware of who's given money to both the Clinton Foundation and Secretary Clinton's campaign. There's a lot of elite donors behind her, and we're also well aware of the fact that she says one thing to Goldman Sachs and another thing when she's stumping, hoping to get Bernie Sanders' supporters to go with her. Any concerns about who's the captive or who's the candidate of elite donors in this election?
Well, what I'm saying is that for a long time, there has been the hope on the part of these people who perceive themselves as disenfranchised that the Republican Party would represent their interests. And that party has failed to do so. I don't think they ever went to the Democrats and asked the Democrats to represent their interests. I think the Democrats, the first thing I want to say here is to say that the main differences between her publicized speeches to Goldman Sachs and so on and her policies are differences where I actually think the private speeches are better. That is to say, she favors free trade. She always has. She has for 40 years, and now, unfortunately, that's politically unacceptable in the U.S., even though it's probably sound economic policy. And so in order to consolidate her support within the party, she's changed her policy, and I think it's a change of policy. I don't think that it's a lie or a deception. She said to Goldman Sachs what she personally believes, what she always has believed, but in order to bridge a split in the party, in order to bridge a possible split, she has changed her official view. I think that's compromise. I don't see anything wrong with compromise, except that I wish that it had actually come out the other way, because I think that the protectionist policies are doomed. They're economically unsound, and so I do blame Sanders for introducing a note of bogus economics into the campaign. But anyhow, as to the Clinton Foundation, if one looks at that, they are actually trying to promote good lives in developing countries. Now, that's something I've spent most of my career on. I know a lot about what they do, and I don't think it has anything to do with the United States, basically at all. And if rich people like Gates and many others are giving money to alleviate problems of poverty in the developing world, well, that's great. I think it has nothing to do with American elections or American politics, and it should never have been brought into contact with that.
Martha Nussbaum, I could talk to you for another half an hour, and that still wouldn't be nearly enough. I've enjoyed this so much, and I hope you have too. We're really grateful you spared some time for us tonight on TVO. We want to remind everybody your latest book is called Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, Justice. Thank you for joining us on the line from Chicago.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot.
And lots of luck to both the Cubs and the Blue Jays the rest of the way out.
Yeah, absolutely. Go Blue Jays. If any Blue Jay supporters are actually watching tonight, which maybe they're not.
All the best.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.